I noticed the other day that if you search for most difficult piano pieces, you get a wide range of options. Some picks are decent, like La Campanella by Liszt. Often you find picks that aren't necessarily horrendous, but they're also not quite the right answer, like the last movement of Moonlight. It is difficult. It isn't near the upper echelon of difficulty. And sometimes you see picks that are just horrendous, like this reputable source of classical music for the masses says Chopin's E-flat Nocturne. Not even one of the 50 or maybe 100 most difficult Chopin pieces. The first piece up here is going to be one of the most obvious, easiest picks to the list. We're just going to get out of the way first. It's also one of the most incredible pieces ever written, and that is Hammerklavier by Beethoven, Opus 106. Now, Beethoven being my favorite composer, I was really tempted to put multiple of his pieces on the list: Hammerklavier, Passionata, really Opus 101, 106, 9, 10, 11. But Opus 106 definitely stands out as the most difficult of all of them. And I think a lot of people assume it's because the first movement is so challenging. But I would say Beethoven has many pieces like this with extremely difficult, long first movements. What sets apart Hammerklavier in my mind is really two things. One of them is the massive slow movement that, if you play well, can leave an impression on your audience that they will leave there and love music, love Beethoven, love that piece, or maybe just music in general. They might just love life for the rest of their life. It's one of the most beautiful, gorgeous things to ever exist. But it's like 15 minutes, give or take, depending on how fast you play it. If you play it slow and boring, not slow and interesting, people might literally fall asleep. It takes a lot of musicianship, a lot of management to pull off a massive, massive slow movement that really isn't impressive. It never gets that hard to play. It's just hard to pace. But if that wasn't hard enough, the last movement also has a fugue. And by the way, I'm not giving these pieces to you in difficulty order, just in case that wasn't clear so far. Now, our next piece is a completely different style, but also an easy pick for the list, and that is Gaspard by Ravel. This piece is like, blows your mind difficult, even the first movement, but it is a piece that when you hear the first movement, you might just think, oh, it's pretty. It's obviously hard if you watch someone do it. Little known fact for those of you who watch gamers, like competitive video gamers, you ever see people do this thing where they hit the mouse with multiple fingers, or they maybe use 3 fingers for a mouse, or they just have the really fast twitch? Ravel actually invented that. So if you think your favorite streamer or competitive gamer made that up, nope. It's been around for a while. Classical musicians have been fast twitching their fingers because it's kind of like a special achievement in this piece. Like, yes, you can switch fingers, but if you can do it with one finger, you get like a special gold star. I'm actually only being half sarcastic. Classical musicians are huge nerds. When someone says they're playing this piece, one of the first questions is, are you using one finger or are you doing finger switches on the last movement? So yeah, we need to get out more. For our next piece, we're going to take it back. I mean, way back. Okay, not like Palestrina, but pretty far back to J.S. Bach. Now, J.S. Bach, kind of like Beethoven earlier, has a lot of candidate pieces that could go onto this list. There's like all the suites, there's dedicatoes and fugues. A lot of pieces that stress out a lot of piano players, honestly. But I gotta give it to Goldberg variations, mostly because the length, like this is not a length competition. Just because you have the longest piece does not mean you have the hardest piece. But this is like challenging piece after piece after piece. Variation to variation is really difficult. It's hard to actually pin down like that one is the one everyone struggles with. And it's the hardest one. You're just like, okay, yeah, okay, you got to number 10, good for you, but can you play 11 through 15? Can you play 16 through 20? Can you play 21 through 25? Like, there's just a lot of challenge in this piece. It's also gorgeous. It's a beautiful intro. I mean, one of the most beautiful intros. Can I say that? Once you say the most beautiful thing Bach wrote, someone's like, well, what about these other 1,000 pieces he's wrote, right? But it's an amazing piece of music. But it's an amazing as well as a daunting piece of music that's just a pretty overwhelming task to ask a piano player, hey, in your spare time this week, can you go learn Goldberg and then perform it this weekend? It's not one of those pieces. It's a piece you have to learn, commit a long time, and live with it for a while to pull off well. Up next is going to be the most controversial pick on the list, I think, because there isn't a good option. I'm talking about Liszt here. I mean, Liszt lived and thrived on difficult pieces. You could say not all of them are great, but there are plenty that are great that could go onto this list. So my personal biasness really wants to put the Tarantella in here. However, I'm probably going to have to give it to the B minor sonata, a piece I haven't played, but is also really difficult. And just the length of it might make it more challenging because there's just more things to stress about. Also, it's a controversial piece whether or not it's good. It's been argued about for 150 years or not, like whether or not this sonata is a good sonata, which means it's a hard one to pull off. I mean, you can't just play this like some Liszt pieces that are really short and just really flashy. You can almost get through it on just flair, but you can't do that with a 30-minute piece. It's a very different challenge. I just say, hey, play a 5-minute etude and show off and wow the audience, and everyone just applauds and cheers because it's so hard. But can you keep them interested for a 30-minute epic? It's just a much different challenge. Whether or not you think the B minor sonata is a great piece or not a great piece, in the hands of a master pianist, it can be an amazing, amazing piece, and it's really difficult. So yeah, I kind of cheated there. I don't want to say the Tarantella because I think the B minor sonata is more difficult, but I did kind of sneak the Tarantella in there subtly. So haha, you've heard it now. If you don't know it, go listen to the Tarantella from the Years of Pilgrimage. Great piece. Up next here we have Stravinsky's Petrushka, which every time you say this or someone who's like, why are you doing a piano arrangement? Then someone has to be like, no, it's not a piano arrangement. Stravinsky actually arranged it for piano himself, and it is wildly difficult. Now, I told you for Liszt, I didn't want to let my personal bias skew me too much. However, for my next composer, I am. And that's because I have played a very difficult piece by this composer. I haven't played, of course, all of his music because very few people have. And I thought, I wonder how difficult the piece I play ranks. And I saw a ranking system put out by, I think it was a publisher, who kind of had like, here is this composer's most difficult solo piano music. And this was in the top tier. So I was like, done. That's enough to let my personal bias take over and say, well, if they put, not saying publisher rankings are good in general, because sometimes they're not, but I'm going to go with this one right now and say for Brahms, we have Handel variations. In a sense, the Handel variations by Brahms actually presents a really similar challenge to the Bach Goldberg variations earlier, even though they're totally different styles for the most part. And that's that so many of them are really difficult. You don't have a bunch of freebies. There are a couple of the Brahms that are pretty easy, but there's just many of them that are challenging. They're tricky. They last for 30 seconds, maybe a minute, and you're on to the next challenge. And that just like makes it very difficult to play it, to be in one mode, maybe like double six mode. You play the double six one, then immediately you switch gears to like big octaves and slow and pounding. And you switch gears again to like little light staccato notes. So that all makes it hard. Ironically, this also has a fugue in it. So a little Bachian, I guess you could say at the end. And the fugue is probably the most difficult part. That might be kind of like unique about this piece. Is it probably definitely, I found the double six variation to be the most difficult thing. That's the thing I stressed about most when performing it, because if you kind of get off the rails, well, here you can listen. Do you hear that? Like if you get off the rails a little with that, I find it really hard to get back on. I didn't stress as much about the fugue. However, you have to play a, I think it's 3 or 4 minute fugue at the end. But just the stamina to be 20-25 minutes into a piece that loud and then pound out a massive fugue and have all the running notes and not just have your arms completely fall off. It is a really difficult piece. I actually thought some people would say the sonatas, and I think the Brahms sonatas are probably comparable in difficulty to this. So if you are like, you want to go to your grave saying the sonatas are more difficult than the variations and you have played both, I'm not going to argue too much with you. So you really can't go too wrong between the sonatas and the Handel variations, the Paganini variations, but I'm picking Handel. By the way, if you're enjoying this video and you're thinking that someday you might want to play a piece this difficult, or at least maybe improve from where you're at the piano, I would consider checking out my Patreon page down below. I'm putting some bonus learning material there. So you also see some cool behind the scenes stuff, like the new setup was revealed there first. If you like that kind of stuff, or you just want to support the channel, support what I'm doing here, help me grow in the future, I'd really ask you, check it out, see if it's interesting to you, considering supporting the channel that way. Let's move on to the next piece. And now for our next piece, you know, they say if you can't be wealthy or necessarily good looking, you can at least have a unique personality to kind of stand out in the crowd. Or you could say you could be awkward. And that's kind of the case with our next piece. It's Schubert, Wonder of Fantasy. And it is difficult. I'm not saying it's not difficult, but this piece is also famous for just being awkward under the hands. Actually, lots of Schubert is famous for being just awkward under the hands. It doesn't lie well. It's not the how we expect to do arpeggios, like double notes and those rolls. I have a bug landing on me. Here's a little of the first movement. Now, if you played this piece before, just let me know if you think the first movement or the fourth movement is more difficult. It's kind of hard to tell unless you play it for yourself, I suppose, but let me know what your thoughts are. Now we come to another fairly controversial one. Not saying my pick is necessarily going to be just massively terrible, but I think there's a lot of good options for that. And that's a piece from Chopin. Once again, kind of like Liszt, kind of like Beethoven. I don't want just to have tons of pieces from the same composer on here. Even though Chopin has multiple good options for the list, I'm going with the fourth Ballade. I think for me, the Ballades are better pieces than the sonatas. I know that statement in of itself can be wildly controversial, but I find the Ballades to be kind of the perfect composition for Chopin as far as the freedom he gets to express in them, but then like the beauty he finds in them. Not saying the other pieces are bad. That's always a problem when you have to pick one, is it makes it seem like you hate the other ones. I basically love every note Chopin wrote. I can hardly think of a Chopin piece I don't really like. Maybe a couple of the preludes, but hardly anything Chopin wrote I don't like. I'm just going with the fourth Ballade. I love the first Ballade too, as you probably know if you've been around the channel before. I think the fourth Ballade is a little harder. I think it's hard to make a definitive argument that any of its other pieces are way harder than the fourth Ballade, and I think it's also a really good sounding piece. Oh, I'm also not saying that the etudes aren't really good pieces. They are. The etudes are great pieces. I think the Ballade probably outshines them in difficulty just because the wide range of different techniques you have to do to pull them off. It's not like one or two or three techniques, but it's just a bunch of different things, and you have to be super musical. The fourth Ballade has long sections that can be boring as watching paint dry unless you can make them beautiful. You can add like character and emotion to them. So It's fourth Ballade for me, even though there are many good answers for this one. Now, real quick, share this video with some friends. Leave some nice comments down below. If we all work together, we can make this the most definitive source for the most difficult piano pieces. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best Liszt ever made, but I also didn't say the Chopin E-flat Nocturne was the most difficult piece ever. So it's not the worst.